Now that we've made the case that the private marketplace won't provide public goods or will undersupply them, our next question is this: how do we ensure that the government provides an economically efficient supply of a public good? In real-world terms, how do we as a society decide how much national defense and flood control is optimal? And how many lighthouses and parks should our government provide? To answer these questions, we have to understand more about the demand for public goods and, more importantly, how the market demand curves for private and public goods differ. The basic distinction is this: the market demand curve for private goods is the horizontal sum of the individual demand curves. Because of this, individual consumers will pay the same price for a good but consume different quantities. In contrast, the market demand curve for a public good is the vertical sum of the individual demand curves, and individual consumers will all consume the same amount of the good but value that amount at different prices. To illustrate this distinction, let's start with the demand schedules of Carlos, Carla, and Leon for a private good like corn. Take a quick minute to fill in the blanks in the last column and then try to draw the individual demand curves and the market demand curve from this table. Here is what your figure should look like. Graphically, you can see that the market demand curve D is found by summing horizontally the individual demand curves D1, D2, and D3. Now, when we add a supply curve, equilibrium in this market will occur where supply equals demand, which, as we have already learned, is also where social marginal benefits equal social marginal costs. Thus, in a competitive market, this equilibrium output will be economically efficient because it maximizes the combined well-being of the buyers and sellers, the only people affected by the transactions. Now contrast this situation with the demand schedules for national defense of Mr. Hawk and Mr. Dove. And note that these demand schedules are phantom demand curves because, as I have already explained, these two people will not actually reveal their true preferences in the marketplace about how they value defense, but rather preferred a free ride. However, for the purposes of this example, we can assume that this information has been discovered through an opinion survey indicating the willingness of both Mr. Hawk and Mr. Dove to pay for added units of national defense. Can you draw the market demand curve for this public good? Just remember to sum vertically. Here are the individual demand curves and the collective demand curve. If the government provides 2 units of national defense, Mr. Hawk would be willing to pay $4 for it, while Mr. Dove would be willing to pay only $3. Summing these amounts gets us to $7 on the collective demand curve. Similarly, at 4 units, Mr. Hawk would ante up $2, while Mr. Dove would be willing to pay only $1. Thus, the price for 4 units is $3. Now let's finally answer our question about what the optimal quantity of a public good provided by the government should be. Let's do that by adding a supply curve to our graph. This supply curve, of course, slopes upwards because of the law of diminishing returns, which applies whether we are producing private goods like muffins or public goods like missiles. And this supply curve also measures the marginal cost to society of providing each unit of defense. The optimal output occurs, therefore, at the intersection of supply and demand, where the social marginal benefit equals the social marginal cost. So what's the optimal quantity in this case? The optimal quantity in this case is 3 units. At 3 units, the combined willingness to pay for the extra unit, the marginal benefit to society, just matches that unit's marginal cost of $5. You can see then that this marginal benefit equals marginal cost principle is analogous to both the MR equals MC output rule and the MRP equals MRC input rule for maximizing profit.